I think when we are designing a new product, first we have to understand what already is, especially when we are like introducing a new material. And I think the key for innovation is actually understanding how people have been, like for instance, like introducing like regenerative practices, like even like learning from fermentation, or like in that sense, and how we can apply those principles that they've been using for centuries into like our contemporary needs that we have. And that's something that I will definitely, like it's a narrative that is really present on my own personal project, Co-Obradoiro Galego, but in like my day-to-day, like as designer, trying to find solutions for lifestyle brands as well, is something that I think it plays a key role, that balance between innovation and also like the idea of past, like knowledge and learning from it.
Hey folks, welcome to the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast. Our guest this week continues the design theme of the last couple of episodes, but takes a hop over the pond. Paula Camiña Eiras is a biodesigner who has worked with one of my favorite brands, Dulcie, formerly known as Heckles, and is an associate lecturer in biodesign at Central St. Martin's in London. In this episode, we talk about her journey from and return to Spain for one of her more interesting projects, and her work with Dulcie, along with what it's like to work with the next generation of biodesigners at Central St. Martin's. We talk about material innovation and regenerative thinking, as well as bioremediation, and even touch on biomimicry. Paula is hands down one of our most interesting guests to date, so I hope you enjoy the episode. Before we get to the episode, I want to share a quick book recommendation. One of the folks in the environmental movement I most admire is a guy named Bob Brown in Australia. He's a doctor turned activist and politician, where he was the first federal parliamentary leader of the Greens. He has a relatively new book out titled Defiance that I just started, and it has already given me a bit of a boost. Using examples from his own life and others, he paints a picture of why we need to double down on fighting the good fight to protect our only home planet. It really has me fired up again, and I can't recommend it anymore. Finally, make sure you stick around for our next few episodes, as we'll be shifting the creative conversation about our relationship with nature from design to food. Our guests include Ben Shuri of Attica in Melbourne, who you probably know from Chef's Table, Rob Ruba of Oyster in Washington, D.C., which has won pretty much every award the last few years, and a really innovative guy named Pablo Uso-Biaga, who has set up Arcatiera and the restaurant Baldio in Mexico. These are absolute can't-miss episodes, so please make sure you're subscribed. Without further delay, here is the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast with biodesigner Paula Camiña Eiras. Today on the Ecosystem Member Podcast, I'm really excited to be joined by Paula Camiña Eiras, designer, specialized in material innovation for lifestyle brands, and also works in academia. Thanks so much for joining us today, Paula.
Thank you for having me, Rick.
So we always ask our guests, same first question. How do you think about or define your relationship with nature? And then maybe you could start to talk a little bit about how that influences the work you do around material innovation.
Yeah, sure. I think actually to answer this question, like it takes me back to like where I'm from. So I'm from Spain, from like a small region in the northwest of Spain that is called Galicia. And Galicia is a region that is like really well known for its gastronomy, but also like a really strong sense of like cultural identity, as well as for its beautiful landscapes. And I think when I look back into like my happiest like memories, like when I was growing up there, they are all like surrounded by nature. And I think that's where my appreciation, like kind of like relationship with nature started. And that's why as a designer, I have this desire not only to design for like humans, but also like being aware of the impact that my design is going to have like in the planet.
And so you work as a material designer. We also mentioned you do some work in academia.
Mm-hmm.
associate lecturer at Central St. Martin's in London, on biodesign, I think what I gleaned from your bio. But like we said, you've also worked with brands. There's a brand called Dulcie, formerly known as Pickles, which is one of my favorite brands. There's a lot of really amazing stuff. So maybe just if you could give us like a general overview, like what is biodesign? What is material innovation? Like how do these two things interact?
Yeah, that's actually a question that I get asked like so many times. But yeah, biodesign actually is like this discipline that is like an intersection of like design and science. So basically, as designers, we'll be integrating like biological principles, like in the design methodology. And there are, of course, different ways of applying, like this biodesign, like approach. It could be by developing like new materials. For instance, if we are talking about like a term like biofabrication. So like when we use like living organisms to like develop like new materials, as it could be like mycelium, for instance. But then also we can be talking about, for instance, like biomimicry, like what happens when we are inspired by shapes that we can find like in nature, shark, like textures with like antimicrobial properties. And what else? Like one of my favorite ones, for instance, is like bioremediation actually. That is when we like design using biology to like restore like ecosystems. So like imagine that we could like regenerate the land, or we could like clean like toxic waters through like a new material.
And so you just mentioned regenerating the land. I know regenerative thinking is a big part of what you do, and I think you've done some workshops for companies on it as well. I know regenerative agriculture from past guests on the podcast, but what is regenerative thinking, and how does that apply to a large business?
Yeah, like you just mentioned it, when delivering like workshops actually for Sarah Home, which is a large home brand company, I will start by defining what is like regenerative like design. And these workshops, just to like give a little bit of context, are workshops that I will deliver to people that don't necessarily have previous understanding of like regenerative like thinking, or like they don't work like on design departments. It could be like people that they work like on marketing or supply chain, really diverse like people that I'm talking to. So I will start by defining what is sustainable design, right? So the idea of like doing less bad. But then I will start to introduce the idea of like what is regenerative like design. So when we are talking about regenerative design, we are talking about regenerating the ecosystem. And how we can do this is like, for instance, like what happens if like in our design solutions, we start to integrate like materials that they have been, for instance, grown, that we have harvest, actually following, right, the idea of like regenerative agriculture. And then what happens by the end of the life of these materials if they also give back to the soil, if they give back in forms of nutrients. So we are talking about compostable materials.
And there's one project that you've widely exhibited and you've been recognized for. I probably won't pronounce this correctly, so you might have to restate it for me. But Co-Obradoiro Galego?
That was actually really good.
Okay, thank you. So maybe some of these ideas that you've just been talking about, I know reading about the project that they're a part of that. So can you kind of tell us about like materials, connection to place, this remediation and regenerative thinking, like how all that sort of came together in that project and what the response has been?
Yeah, you know what? I have to say that I guess like 5 years ago when I started, with this project, which was my final master's project in biodesign at Central St. Martin's, I didn't think well through like the name, because definitely, like there is like challenge in there. Um, but a really easy way, like I think to start just playing the project is by explaining the title of the project, Co-Obradoiro Galego. He's like, the name actually is in Galician. So Galician is like my native language that we speak in Galicia. So that's like Galego is how it's called, the Galician language. And then Obradoiro is the word that we will use to like call the workshop, like the making a space of basket weavers. And co for like collaboration, because it's a project in collaboration with like artisans, with basket makers. And it's like project that is at the intersection between like crafts and biodesign. as me as a biodesigner, like collaborating with like these basket makers. Just to summarize a little bit of like the project and the type of like question that like I'm trying to like answer through it is like a project that it starts by questioning like how we can connect like the industry of like fishing with like the basketry community in Galicia by highlighting the environmental like challenges and also like the idea of like how we can preserve like our heritage. And to find the answer to the question, I started by having conversations with like fishing industry. At the end of the day, the fishing industry is key for the local economy in Galicia. And by having these conversations, could see potential that of like a waste from this community could become valuable resource for the basket weaving community. So I'm talking in the first collection, I work with seafood shells. And from these seafood shells, I was able to develop like a flexible yarn. And the same I apply for the second collection, like the same philosophy and thinking process that it was using seaweed. In this case, it was sea lactus from this specific area island in Galicia that is called Arosa Island. And what happens with this sea lettuce is that basically suffocating the clams because it doesn't let the clams to breathe and is responsible for the 15-20% of like of this. So as a result of this material investigation, we have two collections. The first collection is a series of 4 different pieces, like in which the design is coming from symbols or kind of elements that we can find like in the Galician culture. And those pieces were we've been combining local fibers like wicker and wood with these seafood shells like material. And then on the other side, the second collection in the seaweed was like woven in combination with wood. For that case, the pieces actually were kind of playing, kind of doing a tribute to the work of like this like community. And that's why the baskets were inspired by the tools that they use like in their day to day when they go like fishing, like they harvesting the clams.
Very cool. And what was the reaction from the basket weavers? I mean, there's a lot of amazing photos online, and not to stereotype, but these look like local older women who have been doing this for decades. And you come in and you say, I've got this waste from the fishing community, or, waste in quotations, because it turns out it can be very valuable. But I've got this material from the fishing communities we'd like to integrate in your process. Were they open to it? Were they questioning? What was what was their reaction?
You know what? Actually, they were not questioning it at all. And there is a beautiful video documentary of 5 minutes on YouTube that is narrated in first person by Ruben Berto, who was a basket weaver. He was actually when having a conversation with him where everything made total sense because by having conversations directly with the community, like I got to like understand like the challenges that they were suffering, that they were struggling with. And by saying this, like, I mean, what's happening, like, in the landscapes in Galicia, sadly, is that eucalyptus is taking, like, basically most of it in the sense of, like, native tree species are struggling to survive with the integration of, like, these non-native species. And how this has, like, a direct impact in the basket weaving, like, craft is because, like, the eucalyptus become like it's not compatible with the traditional like woven techniques. So actually it was when it made perfect sense to like bring these kind of like alternative, like materials to start to like explore how we could produce, like baskets with it. At the end of the day, it's following the same philosophy that they've been following for years, in the sense of basket weavers will make use of the local resources they had around them. And that's exactly what we are doing.
So yesterday I was recording another episode with a chef named Ben Shuri, who runs Attica in Melbourne, and he really focuses on native plants and ingredients. And one of the things that is now sort of sparking this connection between your process and his is he talked about listening to the native plants and trying to understand from them what they wanted to become. And it sounds like a lot of your work as a designer is actually not as much creation. I mean, that seems there's probably a lot of that too, but actually just like listening to people and understanding the materials and what the material and what the people already know or already are capable of. Is that fair? Like, how do you balance that listening and creation as a designer?
Like I think that's it. I think when we are designing a new product, first we have to understand what already is, especially when we are like introducing a new material. And I think the key for innovation is actually understanding how people have been, like for instance, like introducing like regenerative practices, like even like learning from fermentation, or like in that sense, and how we can apply those principles that they've been using for centuries into like our contemporary needs that we have. And that's something that I will definitely, like it's a narrative that is really present in my own personal project, Co-Obradoiro Galego, but in like my day-to-day, like as designer, trying to find solutions for lifestyle brands as well is something that I think it plays a key role, that balance between innovation and also like the idea of past, like knowledge and learning from.
And so thinking about some of that work for lifestyle brands, one example that I saw just a couple days ago was a room diffuser for Dulcie that you created with ceramist Carly Bream. It's made of a selection of byproduct sort of materials, coffee husks, dried wine grapes. One, what does the process look like for integrating those materials? I can imagine me just telling a random person on the street, oh, this solid thing is made from coffee husks and is a diffuser, and them just thinking, well, why doesn't it fall apart? And I guess as part of that process, where does this come from? Is this just talking to people and being like, we have these ingredients, what can we do with it? Or is it more of like, here's what we want to create, let's research what materials might work best? And how do you know it's the right application to use that byproduct or that, in air quotes, waste material in a new product? Maybe you could use the room diffuser or another thing as like an example of initial idea, material research, and then understanding the application and design.
Yeah, actually, let's use the diffuser because is a really good example. I will say like touching base also like in your previous question about like how to be creative. I think, like the like biggest challenge or the way to be like most creative as designers is actually by starting by trying to answer a question instead of like just being like, okay, design a diffuser. More like, okay, this is the challenge. And the challenge in this case, it was like this product is part of like a subscription model that it will be like delivered like each 4 months, which it gives you the opportunity to be a little bit more innovative, right? And to bring like new products. So in this case, the question was like, how can we design products that they will deliver like a better well-being like experience at home, at people's homes? So once that research question is framed, then is when we will like highlight, like what's the key value, what we want to talk about, like in this specific like box. So in this case, it was essence. So it was the idea of essence that it was coming from a sense of like how we can minimize like impact, but also like essence related to like the idea of like scent, right? It starts to make like obvious kind of like sense. So in this case, like I met like Carly like 4 years ago while she was like presenting her final master's project in material futures at Central St. Martin's. Carly was like talking about the idea of like as a ceramist, how she could introduce like local waste to reduce the use of clay. Really interesting like stuff. Then there was opportunity here, right? Like, okay, like it makes sense, to develop a diffuser that is aligned with the essence thing and it's answering to that research question. So I went to Carly with like, could we co-develop this diffuser? How it could take shape? How we could integrate local waste to increase actually the properties of the clay to like work as a diffuser. So in this case, we tested different like type of clays, and the one that we end up using it was porcelain. Porcelain that in combination with coffee has what will happen is that it becomes like porous, which right like makes sense for like a diffuser because you need that in
Mm-hmm.
your clay. And then she was working already with the dry wine grapes. She started to work with them like in her residency in Italy a few years ago. So it was like, okay, why not? We also like introduce, like these dry wine grapes, but from local place here, like Kent. And yeah, the that also leave that effect, like a smoky effect on the surface of the diffuser that relates really well as well with the idea of like sense and diffusing the scent and thing like a room in the space. And it makes each diffuser unique. So that's kind of the process from, from conceptualization to deliver the product into the market.
Were there any other materials that you tried or thought of and didn't work for some reason as part of that research process?
Yeah, definitely. Like we also like try like terracotta. Actually, we were testing like terracotta versus porcelain. During that process, also like we were testing like the amount of coffee has that it was like needed to like bring this like porosity to the material, because the diffuser will have to absorb the oil, but also like like diffuse the sand into the space. So those were the two like materials that we try, and there was like lots of like testing until we found the right ratio that will work.
And so one thing I'm always curious about when I see projects like this that
Mhm.
use sort of byproducts or what most people call, waste materials, and sometimes it feels, I guess, a little bit like a novelty. It's kind of like, a decade or so ago when people would be like, "Oh, this t-shirt's made out of 5 plastic bottles." And then there was this thing that happened a few years ago where it became such a ubiquitous thing that they were like bidding up the price of this recycled fabric, and it kind of lost the essence of the fact that it was trying to reuse a material that wasn't going to be able to be used for something else. So how do we take using dried grape leaves or coffee husks to be something that's not just a novelty but could be used could it be used by a large company in a scalable fashion, or is it just by nature of the product and it being a byproduct or a waste piece, is it limited in some sense inherently because of its characteristics?
That's a really good question, and I think that's something to consider when we are delivering like bio design like based solutions. I think for me, like we start with certain advantage actually when we start by understanding kind of like the default technology, right? So in the sense of like, I think the most kind of like resilient solutions that we will be able to deliver in terms of like new materials are the ones that start by understanding the processes that already exist and how we adapt those processes or we adapt to them.
Um, One of the things that I found really interesting about your work, especially some of your work with Dulcie, is you also work toward contributing to and creating the journal that
Yeah.
talks about the products that you create. I think there's often this popular narrative, some people call it the value action gap, where people say they want to buy more sustainable products, but then if it's more expensive, they won't actually take action on it. Or if it's not abundantly clear, they won't take action on it. So when you think about creating these products that use sort of byproducts or inherently are more sustainable because they're not using a lot of as many virgin materials as they could, how do you think about crafting that narrative around the products to like tell people a really compelling story about, why using this material in the basket weaving, or why using this type of porcelain in the room diffuser alongside these coffee husks does a really interesting job? How do you create a really compelling narrative around the work that you're doing?
The idea of creating a compelling narrative, around like any project or product is something that is being really present since my BA, like industrial design and product development. The idea of how you communicate your product, because you're not always going to be next to your product to be like, hey, this diffuser is actually made from coffee husks. That's not always going to be the case, right? So I think when crafting like these narratives, it starts by highlighting the key values that are attached to that product or business, but also, like the emotional connection that it is attached, to it. And I do think, when those values resonate with people is what it is going to make people to like actually decide to like invest on those kind of more like sustainable like
Hmm.
products that they bring like that kind of like compelling, like narrative around them. Because like we are talking about like sustainable products, that in that narrative we might be talking about like how like they produce like less weight, but also like they offer like a longer lifespan, or also like they are reducing the environmental impact. Yeah, I do think that's something that people like are looking more and more for those kind of like more responsible products as people are becoming more conscious as well of the choices that they make?
Yeah, my wife and I were subscribers to the Heckles box
Yeah.
for a while, and we always got their products because it was nice when you knew that you were done using the face cream or whatever. The packaging didn't have to go in the bin like all the other sort of stuff. It was just easier to manage because it was biodegradable, and you could, put it in the soil, and it wasn't going to harm the soil or anything like that. So I think even simple stuff like that sometimes, I don't know. And my day job is in marketing, and sometimes I think we forget that part of the story of like sometimes, it's big overarching values, but other times it's just the fact that like I get to feel good that I didn't add another thing to the trash bin at the end of using the product.
For sure. It is so important. I think, like actually when we are talking about biodesign, per se is like a multidisciplinary discipline, like in the sense of like you're gonna work with people from different like backgrounds. You might be working with scientists, like other designers or basket weavers, but also like the importance of talking to marketing teams as well. And like how together, like we again like create those like narratives around the products and the values that we want to transmit through like through them.
Yeah. So to kind of bring our conversation with a close, we've talked a lot about your work and your work as a biodesigner. We mentioned at the start that you're also a lecturer. And I'd love to know, you're obviously practicing right now, so that you're not out of the game by any means. But in terms of the next generation of these students that you're working with at Central St. Martin's, like what gets them excited about biodesign? Like what kind of projects are they working on? Like what can we look forward to from not just your work, but these students that you're working with?
You know what? I think what it gets the students the most excited about is when that first day that you like, I'm gonna actually talk in first person because this is something that also like experience, but it's like you as a designer, you are used to like be like in a wood workshop, metal workshop, like fashion workshop, but then out of a sudden you're like in a lab. And that's like actually when it gets tricky, when you're enjoying your experience, learning experience so much in a lab, working with like mycelium, with bacteria, with all these different kind of living organisms. And then you have to go back to the studio and design. That's when things get tricky, honestly, for the students.
I love that. Probably like 10 or 20 episodes ago, we had a glaciologist who was on a TV show with a climber named Alex Honnold. And we talked a lot about the importance of bringing together. Also, there's an artistic duo named Aykroyd and Harvey that they very much use scientific process to create their art. And there's sort of a recurring theme in the podcast is sort of this artificial separation sometimes that's created between art or creativity or design and science. And I think the more that we can merge people who work on both sides, but also get people across both of those bands where a designer is comfortable being in a lab, and we recognize that the scientific process, because of its experimentation, often has inherent creative qualities in it. We might get to, I don't know, maybe you disagree, but we might get to more creative solutions the more that we're able to mix, creativity and science, don't you think?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like that takes me to think about like, like the unexpected results that you can get from how a material behaves to different environments. This is always part of the process when you are developing like a new material and how this material is gonna, react to like a different, humidity or temperature. And sometimes the outcome that you will get is not the one that is you expected. But I'm sure, like from that you can like take like lots of like like learning in the sense of like, well, at least you know what it doesn't work for or what are the limits in terms of use for that material.
And so it's kind of wrap up. Is there anything that you've seen recently? It could be a student project, it could be something you've been working on, it could even be just like a book you've read that has gotten you really excited or sort of re energized about the work that you do. Like maybe it's like a new discovery or a new insight or just a really good story that you heard. What kind of has recently given you energy to do this biodesign work?
There is so like much inspiration, honestly, like out there, especially like I feel like in the city of London with the biodesign program, everything else that is being built around it. Definitely, like the journal. like Dulcie that you mentioned before, like is a really good source of information because in there, like every week, there will be like a new exciting like project in the biodesign field. But one that might not be like super new, but I have to admit and say that this is the one that has always stayed with me since, like I started my journey like in biodesign. It is like the designer Fernando Lapose, actually. And it is, I think, because like, well, he also like studied at Central St. Martin's here in London, but his work, it has so like many like compelling layers in the sense of like how he talks like about regenerative design. Just briefly to like mention a little bit what his work it is about. Fernando Lapose went back to Mexico where he's from. He started to like reintroduce like the native corn, which he will come with like, of course, like, benefits for the land. But also what he's doing is like he's using like a bioproduct, like the leaves from the corn to produce like this kind of surface like material that you can use for furniture, which is really like aesthetically beautiful. But not only that, like also he's employing like local people at the same time. So like I really like love like his work because it does really resonate with my approach to biodesign. It has like the craft layer, it has the social layer, it has of course the environmental one. So those are the kind of like projects that really resonate with me. Is one that has stayed with me for like my 5 years of experience in this.
Fantastic. I'm definitely gonna have to look it up, and we'll make sure to include a link to some of that work as well as your own work and the stuff, Dulcie Journal, etc., that we talked about in the episode. So thank you so much, Paula, for taking time to chat today. Really excited to have you on the podcast and bring this a little bit more light through our audience to your work. So thank you so much again for your time.
No, thank you to you. My pleasure. Honestly, really appreciate it. Thank you.